Okay, I'm here with Denis, former professor of physics from Ottawa University. My name is Jim Larsen. I'm an engineer. I have studied at the Technical University of Denmark, where I studied applied mathematics and technical physics. So I have a master degree in physics and have a physics background, just like Denis. I just finished reading one of your articles, Denis.
But wait, Jim, you also teach at the university at this time, right? You're also a lecturer at the university.
Yes, I teach mathematics and physics every day at the university. And the reason I talk to you today, Denis, is because I just finished reading one of your latest articles. I think it is actually the latest one, right?
Yeah.
It's called All-Cause Mortality During COVID-19, No Plague, and a Likely Signature of Mass Homicide by Government Response.
That's right. It's an analysis I did of all-cause mortality during the COVID-19 epidemic. And I make some conclusions in there. It's important to look at the all-cause data. So that's what I did. I focused on that.
Yes. Okay, so first of all, let me say that I really appreciate your work. I really enjoyed reading this article. I like the way you write, actually, because it's written in a more scientific fashion, where you use logic and scientific reasoning more than you usually see when you read stuff like this. A lot more, actually. So thank you for that. And the reason why I contacted you was because I would like to discuss this article with you and hear some more details about your conclusions.
Yeah, I'm glad to. I mean, you've been following my work for some years, and I know you're appreciative of the work I've done in various areas of science. And I really appreciate that you reached out and gave me feedback, and that we've been discussing informally for on and off for some time. But I'm happy to do this with you, Jim. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let's start. And let's start by looking at your abstract here. First of all, the main conclusion in that article seems to be that actually we had no plague, right? COVID-19 peak is actually perhaps due to government response and media reaction more than it is like, the COVID-19 characteristics itself. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things I do in the paper is that I explain that the data where you try to assign cause of death and count the deaths of a particular cause is basically worthless because of the technical difficulties, for two reasons: because of the technical difficulties in assigning the cause of death, a single cause of death, but also because of the political and professional bias that goes into assigning a cause of death. So the first thing that I argue, and from a review of the literature, I mean, scientists have said this already. I'm not the first to say it, and it's been demonstrated. So it's been well known. So cause of death numbers, numbers of deaths where you're assigning the cause of death and looking only at one cause are basically useless. So what you have to do instead is look at so-called all-cause deaths. And in a case of viral respiratory diseases, it makes a lot of sense to look at all-cause deaths, because these deaths, the total deaths per week, have a very regular cyclical variation. And they're always maximum at the winter. There's this big broad hump at the winter, and then they go down into a trough at the summer. And there's very good reason for that. It's because of how these viral respiratory diseases work and how they induce death by many different comorbidity effects and so on. So there's a strong literature to that effect, which I reviewed in the paper. And I can just show you one of these graphs. It's very stunning. Here's, for example, total morbidity per week from 1972 to 93. I don't know if you can see that.
I see it perfectly, yes.
Yeah, so you can see these peaks that have slightly different shapes and so on. But the thing about this pattern in total deaths per week is that it's extraordinarily regular, and it's very cyclical with the season. And the area under the curve, which represents the total deaths, if you like, that are above the summer trough baseline, that area is pretty much always the same. So irrespective of the fact that you are claiming or seeing or characterizing predominance of certain specific viruses, whether it's influenza or something else that are causing these respiratory diseases, irrespective of the fact that you have virologists who are characterizing the bugs, basically, nonetheless, so you have that viral ecology that's changing and evolving, and there are mutations and everything. But nonetheless, in the end result, the total number of deaths, the winter burden of deaths, is always about the same. The degree of variation is maybe at most some percentage of that hump. So that's one of the very first things that one has to notice. And so if you have what you think is a killer bug, if you think that this coronavirus is a particularly virulent disease, it has to cause more deaths. Otherwise, you can't really think of it as a particularly virulent disease. So the question becomes, can you see additional deaths beyond the regular seasonal variations that are robust, that don't depend on how you attribute deaths? They don't depend on what specifically the bug is and so on. If you are believing that there's an agent that causes more death than usual, then you have to see it in the total mortality. People do this and they see the effects in certain regions of large earthquakes, for example. You can see it. So if there is a catastrophe, whether it's a pathogen or something else, you've got to see it. And so the question I ask myself is, do we see it? Let's look at let's look at the total mortality. So we could start with, California is a state in the United States that has a larger population than Canada. It's a huge state population-wise and so on. So let's look at the total mortality data, all causes, as a function of time on a bi-week basis for California. And in my article, I show this graph. Okay?
Yes.
And we see that this is the recent season here, 2020, up to the data that was available almost to the day that I wrote my article. And you can see that the winter burden, the area under the curve, there's a summer trough baseline that I've drawn there. And the area under the curve is all the extra deaths in the winter, if you like. It's always about the same. It varies from winter to winter. It has features. But this last one has nothing special in it whatsoever.
And does that hold even if you look at some other states that are perhaps more severe, hidden by COVID-19?
Well, exactly. I wanted to start with that one just to show that on a large territory, where in California it's known that many people carry the antibody against this particular virus. It's known that many people were infected. There's nothing special happening here. Okay, so I wanted to start with that, but obviously there's other things going on, which led me to. So that's what the paper is about. So if you look at the entire United States, not just California, then you do see a bit of a special feature. So this is now the data, all-cause mortality for the entire United States.
Okay, yes.
Yep. And
I just have a single question for the graph itself. The general slope that you have of these almost sinusoidal variations, is that due to more people?
Yes.
Coming each year? Okay.
This is the raw data, not corrected or manipulated in any way, and so therefore the population is increasing, and therefore the number of deaths to a first approximation proportionately increase as well, right?
Yes.
So that's why you have a slope on that line. The lines that are perfectly flat have been corrected for this effect. So there you go. That's for the whole United States. So the very first thing you notice, and I explain all this in the paper, is that the area, the winter burden under the curve, is the total number of deaths in the winter season. And it's almost never different. There are sharp features every once in a while, but the total area is the total number of deaths. This last one has what I call the COVID peak, this sharp feature at the end, okay? But if you look at the total area, there's not a lot of area under a sharp peak. If you look at the total area, it's about the same. So
Yes.
that's why I say it's not a plague. You know, there's about the same number of total deaths as usual. Okay, there are immune challenged people. There is a virus going around. People die. People with heart conditions are weakened by a virus. When your immune system has to fight off a virus, that takes a lot of metabolic energy, and you're drawing that energy from functions of other organs and wherever you can. Your body has to do all that management, budgeting the energy, and so people with other conditions will also die. Okay.
But that must mean that there's some kind of overlap between the people that would have died anyway and the people that are now dead, which were attributed to COVID-19, right? There must be some kind of overlap.
That's the whole idea. That's right. That's right. So that's right. So basically, I argue in the paper that this sharp peak is due to the human intervention in the process. It cannot be an epidemic feature. Okay, and so I construct what I think is a rigorous argument in the paper to explain that sharp peak is not a natural epidemic peak, and it has to have resulted from the human intervention. In fact, the red line in that graph is the date at which COVID-19 was declared a pandemic.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So what you find
immediately after WHO declared a pandemic, we see this sharp rise starts immediately after. Yes.
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. And this is true everywhere that in every jurisdiction that there was this sharp COVID peak. Even if it's continents apart, it's synchronous with declaring it a pandemic. Now, declaring it a pandemic is not just a declaration that's on the website somewhere. Declaring a pandemic is the world's most recognized body that guides politicians around the world, okay, saying to everybody, get your act in gear, this thing is coming, prepare yourselves, and start preparing your hospitals right away for a surge in infection and potential death. Okay, you're going to have to be treating a lot of people. So they actually said that. The Director General of the World Health Organization actually said that. And in the article I quote him saying those things. So that was a cue for all the politicians that align themselves with what I would call globalist forces, the forces that, the same people that fund the World Health Organization and that fund all the NGOs around the world and that fund all these think tanks and everything, and that fund most politicians in Western countries and so on. The same people, it all holds together as one big mesh. That's not something I go into in the article, because the article is about using science to demonstrate that this is not a natural feature, this COVID peak. But between you and I, there is definitely a network of influence that is based on money and the control of capital and of money, for sure. There's no, I mean, call it a conspiracy theory if you want. If you think it's an accident that prime ministers on different continents can give exactly the same speech word per word on these disasters, as documented now on YouTube videos and so on. If you think that's an accident, well, fine. I don't. There is a communication network. There's an influence network. There's a self-interest network, and so I tried to see if there was evidence of that it was a non-natural process in the data itself. And so what I found was that, for example, the number of cases per day, and I have lots of graphs like this in the article, this is like the reported number of cases or infections per day, not deaths, so assigned to COVID, and it shoots up right after the pandemic is declared. That's what that vertical line is, okay? And this is true. This exact same graph occurs everywhere around the world at the same time.
So
Okay.
either you would have to say that the WHO was incredibly good at, forecasting this pandemic before it actually started, or you could say that perhaps that graph is not a measure actually of what people think it's a measure of. It's more like a measure of the reaction to the
Yes,
declaration
that
itself.
there's a bias. It would mean that there's a bias created by this announcement of a pandemic in terms of assigning infections to COVID-19
Yes,
and
I
assigning
understand.
death to
But
COVID-19.
is there anywhere in the scientific literature where we can actually quantify this effect of bias from such a declaration?
I don't know of any study that's been done where they quantified it, where they did interviews of scientists and before and after, and they actually looked at this in detail. I don't know of any such study, but I do know that it's been talked about anecdotally by many scientists in their published scientific papers. Like many scientists will say, for example, there is this bias. If in the news they say
the effect is recognized. That's what you're saying, right?
it's
This bias
recognized,
effect.
but I don't know of any study where it's been quantified.
Okay.
Okay, but it's been recognized by leading people in epidemic studies. Some of the leading people have said, "Oh, isn't it strange that all of a sudden this season everyone's dying of this thing that's been announced?" You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I refer to those articles and to those sections in those articles in my paper. I review that.
But also
So
in
yeah,
your paper, you mentioned some peak characteristics that can be used to argue that this is actually artificial,
it's not a
right?
natural. Yeah,
Could you try
yeah,
to
yeah.
go a little bit
So
deeper into that?
sure. So so when you look at this peak, and in the article I show this data for, this is the United States, but I also show it for Europe and separately for England and Wales. And I think I do one or two states as well. And so when you look at this peak, it always has the same features, which is, first of all, it's extraordinarily, unusually narrow. So in science, we talk about when we have a peak like this in a spectrum or in a data series like this, we talk about the full width at half maximum of the peak. Okay.
Please
So
let's explain that a little bit further, just for the listeners as well, Denis.
okay. So you have a peak like this, and you have to say, well, what's the baseline? Well, it's over here, the summer baseline. So this is the height of the peak. And if you go to half of the height and across, you measure the width of the peak. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yes, yes.
So that would be the full width at half maximum. Well, any of these other similarly, or not similarly, but not as sharp, any of these others sharp features, if you do that, you get peak widths of, 9 to 15 weeks, let's say. Across time that you never get a sharper peak than about that. This peak has a full width at half maximum of approximately 4 weeks everywhere that it occurs. It's unusually narrow, okay, with a very sudden onset of death and a very sudden crash of deaths. The deaths stopped occurring very quickly as well. So that is a special feature of this peak that is unnatural in my view. Now, there are several features of the peak that are unnatural. Another feature is that the so-called COVID peak, that's what I called it, occurs on the late side of this regular hump.
Yes, I see
Okay,
that.
so it occurs late in the infectious season for viral respiratory diseases.
So let me just see if I can understand that. What we would have expected, if we look at the data to the left, was something similar to all the other, spikes on the curves, right? We would expect actually to go down from that point, but then suddenly we get this peak at a place where we didn't expect it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, so that's another thing, is that it's rare that you see a W shape like that, where you have a peak, you go down, and then you go up again. That's
Yeah.
rare enough in its own. But what I'm saying is something else. So that is maybe that's another feature that I should argue is unnatural. But there are actually examples of that in the past. Okay, but they're not as uh, dramatic as this one. So I didn't use that feature. But what I'm saying is that the is over to one side, because what you have to understand is that these infectious disease peaks are always occurring at the same time in the season. If you were to overlay these starting at the same week in each year, they would all overlay on each other and they would all be about the same width. Okay, there are many publications that show this. It's quite remarkable. So there is a cycle, and this sharp feature is occurring late in the cycle, after week 11 of 2020 is when it starts to surge up. Okay, so it's occurring late in the cycle. So there is no other example in recorded history of these deaths of occurring this late in the infectious cycle. So it's a first. Okay.
And is there any way that this could actually be attributed to the characteristics of the virus itself? That perhaps the what would you say, the period of infection would be shorter in some way to get
well,
this.
The period is one thing. I'm talking about the positioning of the peak now in the season, right? So that's a feature. So what do we've got so far? We've got the width of the peak. We've got the position of the peak. These are both unusual. And the another unusual feature is that it always occurs immediately after the date at which the pandemic was declared.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And so this is true in the US. It's true in New York. It's true in England and Wales. It's true in all of Europe. You can say what you want about how long it takes for the virus to get from Europe to the US and so on. It is perfectly synchronous. Here's England and Wales, okay? So you got a sharp peak that surges up right after that red line where the pandemic is declared, okay? All right, that's England and Wales. You can do Europe. And again, the sharp peak is over to one side and surges right after the pandemic is declared. Okay.
That's quite interesting in and of itself, right? Because that's really unlikely because when you look at those, you would expect it to not do that. So nobody could have actually foreseen that. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's just
if it was a true phenomena, nobody could have.
Look, it's a crazy thing, because if you look at these other peaks, all right, and the sequence of the other peaks throughout the seasons, and you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, they have different relative heights, they have different shapes, some of their details are different, right? As you go to Europe, as you go from state to state in the US, they move around. But not this peak. This peak is always equally sharp, positioned exactly at the same place, shooting back down, and synchronous across continents, all right? So forget about how long it would take for the virus to travel and all the mechanisms of transmission of the virus across continents and everything. This peak is synchronous in the world, and it's synchronized to the World Health Organization declaring that this is a pandemic. Okay, so that's pretty unusual. So that's a third feature that is unusual of this peak. And another fourth feature is that this magical peak, this unusual peak, occur when you go from state to state in the United States. It occurs in some states and jurisdictions and does not occur at all in others. Like I showed California. I could show, I showed California before. And the one I just showed is Texas, another large state in population-wise and territory-wise, I guess, too. And there's no sharp COVID peak in these territories, even though there's plenty of infections and everything, okay? None of the 7 states in the United States that did not have lockdowns have a sharp COVID peak, have a COVID peak at all. So if you take the 7 states where they did not impose a lockdown, there's no, of those 7, there's no COVID peak there. So the COVID peaks occurred in jurisdictions that prepared their hospitals by emptying beds and shipping out the sick and vulnerable and so on to homes, to long care health facilities, and to such places as that. In Canada, the province that had the most deaths did this aggressively, and that was the province of Quebec. The provinces that didn't do it aggressively or didn't think they had to did not have anywhere near the per capita deaths as Quebec did. So you look at all this and you think, well, okay, here's this very unusual feature in the total mortality, and it's not, it makes no sense from an epidemics point of view, it makes no sense from a viral point of view. Nothing like this has ever been seen before in terms of natural epidemics, but it's got all these features that tie it to human action. So I concluded in my paper that I postulated that this peak represented a mass homicide by government action, by government response to the COVID pandemic, and that it ties into all these reports in the media, these horror stories of people being infected in long care health facilities and so on, in old folks' homes and so on. And I analyzed that in my paper. I look at how an infection works, why you die from it. And one of the important features is that stress, in the general sense, metabolic stress, but also part of metabolic stress is the stress through how you perceive your environment, that it can be stressful, okay? Stress is the most important, has the most important impact on your immune system, including the stress from comorbidity conditions, right? Metabolic stress. So the people who are stressed already are the immune vulnerable people. They're the ones that are at highest risk of dying, but they're also the ones that if you move them and change their circumstances and don't see them as often because there's less staff around to take care of them, and don't change their bed as often and so on, if you put them in an environment that is stressful, you're going to make them even more immune vulnerable than they would have been otherwise if you hadn't moved them. So I think the combination of it's logical that the combination of these effects would have caused a lot of people to die who would not have died within that COVID peak in those 4 weeks, but instead would have had a more natural life cycle in the place where they were at, seeing their family. Also, you isolated them from their family. That's a very stressful thing. So they would have had a more natural death pattern, and they would have survived weeks and months longer. Now, if I'm right about that, then it means that you might see a slight dip of mortality below the baseline in the following weeks. So I'll be following the data as it comes out to see if there is that. It wouldn't be very big. It wouldn't be a very noticeable effect because the total area here anyway is about the same as the previous years. So it's not going to be a big effect, but there might be a visible, measurable effect of that. I mean, year to year there are correlations. See, if the virus kills off vulnerable people a lot in one season, and if they normally would have survived a year or more, then there are less of them to kill off in the next season. So there is this kind of cyclical correlation from season to season. So one could try to analyze that and look at it. But those are details. The big point is the winter burden is not any different in terms of the statistical variation that we observe over the decades than it would normally be. But there is this unusual sharp feature, the COVID peak, that cannot be explained from an epidemics point of view, I believe, and that I postulate is due to human intervention. That's pretty much what my article is about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to look at the data, actually, I would say. It makes a lot of sense the way you present it. There's one.
Yes, sorry, go ahead. You have other questions.
There was just one comment that you made in your paper that I didn't understand. I would like you to explain if you could do that for me. Let me see if I can find it here. You say something like, if my view of this mechanism is correct, that we have this physical loss rather than viable decay from gravitational effect on these aerosol particles that carries the virus particles, right? It means that social distancing, mask and hand washing can have little effect. Could you explain why that is the case? Because couldn't it be that, you know, washing your hands and social distancing and mask could have some effect independently on whether the gravitational theory of loss of particles is true or not?
Yeah, I mean, you write a paper and you don't want it to be 100 pages long, and also you don't have time to write a book, so you don't always explain in great detail everything that how things imply other things and so on. Sometimes you just state it, you put it out there, and you wait for someone like yourself to ask the question. But basically, that part of the paper talks about the mechanism of transmission and what's known about the mechanism, and how can we explain how regular the winter burden is across decades. How do we understand that? How would virologists explain it, and are there alternative ways of understanding it, and so on? So you have to, in order to interpret that and understand it, you have to try to figure out what the mechanism of transmission is. So what I argue in the paper is that it's seasonal for a very good reason, and it's now understood. There's these researchers, Shaman et al. In 2010 wrote a landmark paper that showed that the transmissivity of all these viral respiratory diseases was controlled by absolute humidity of the atmosphere. Okay, and it varied dramatically. The so-called R0, the reproduction number of the disease, varied dramatically with absolute humidity of the atmosphere. And that's why there's high transmissivity in the winter when the air is very dry, and very low transmissivity in the summer when the air is not so dry. And winter and summer are inverted in the northern and southern hemisphere, and it follows the same pattern but inverted, because the winter in the southern hemisphere is during our summer. So that's when they have this infectious cycle. So it's understood now that absolute humidity is the main controlling factor of why these are infectious in a cyclical way like this. So my argument in the paper is, if that's understood, we have to that should be one of our paradigms to interpret these phenomena, okay? Because it's clear now, okay? You make a discovery, you use it. you understand something, you put new glasses on, and you look at the phenomena with that new understanding. So the reason that humidity matters is because the disease is transmitted by aerosol particles, and aerosol particles, if it's in humid air, will condense water, get bigger, and gravitationally fall out very quickly.
Yeah.
In dry air, they will be stabilized. They'll stay small, or they'll even get smaller by evaporation, but not so much. They'll stay small, and they will be part of the fluid air. They'll be carried with the fluid as though it were part of the fluid, because they're small enough for that. And those are the particles, therefore, that transmit the disease. So it's smaller than about 2 microns. And I say smaller than because it can be smaller than, okay? It's not 2 microns average, it's smaller than. So those are the particles that transmit the disease. And that's why when you breathe in these particles, they don't have a lot of inertial impact with your mouth and your saliva and go into your digestive system. They follow the flow of the air and they go deep into your lung, into the alveoles, and they infect you, okay? So if you understand that, and that explains why masks don't work. That explains why all the comparative studies, randomized controlled trials, cannot see any statistical advantage in terms of reducing the risk of getting of being infected by one of these viral respiratory diseases. That's why they don't work, because if it's following the flow of the air and it's just part of the air, then the slightest little opening around the mask, whether it's due to a pore or a wrinkle or a hair, anything, means that that's where the air will flow. That's where the less impedance is for the air. And these particles will just follow the air. They're part of that fluid, and they'll get in and they'll get out just as easily. So masks don't work. And that is probably, I would say, that's my best guess of why all these comparative studies find that masks don't work. Okay, fine. So if you accept that, the reason it's a seasonal phenomenon, the reason there's this cycle, and that the transmissivity vector is through these aerosol particles, then that means that all the other possible transmission routes are far more unlikely.
Yeah, because if they were not more unlikely, you wouldn't see this seasonal pattern, right? Because then exactly. if the route of infection was through your hands, then you wouldn't expect it to be seasonally driven at all, right?
That's right. That's right. And it's known that these viruses don't infect the intestinal tract. They infect the lungs. The lung is the vulnerable organ here, and it's through these aerosol particles. These viruses have co-evolved with animals in this way for 1 billion years. They've perfected this. This is how they're transmitted. So it has nothing to do with big spit droplets that a mask can stop. Okay, nothing to do with that. And it has, you can do all the studies in the world and prove that a virus can survive on a surface for an hour or two, or whatever it is that you find in your study. You can say that. You can say there are viruses everywhere. There are viruses everywhere. Everywhere you touch, there's viruses on your hand all the time. There's bacteria on your hands all the time. But it's not relevant to the transmission mechanism. Okay?
Which is also why social distancing must have a limiting effect then.
A limited effect, yes.
Yeah, limited effect, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, basically you get this thing from suspended aerosol particles in enclosed areas in the wintertime. You get into someone's car, you visit someone at their home, you go into an institutional building, you go shopping, wherever you have closed environments where you're not vigorously flushing out the air like you would outside with the wind, these things are suspended in the air. And there are many studies that demonstrate that there's a high density of these very fine aerosol particles in all these places. So that's how it works. And so
that would mean you would also
the problem
say that
is, yeah,
that social distancing would have little effect in a high density population, right? Because the conditions for transmission already exists, even if you do social distancing, right?
Yeah, I mean, you cannot social distance away aerosol particles in a building that you're standing in. Okay? The aerosol particles are carried with the flow of air. It's chaotic. People are moving. And they're everywhere. There's a high density of them near the ceiling, near the floor, everywhere. Okay? You can't get far enough away. The only way to get away, the only social distance you can do is get out of the building and stay outside, okay, where there's wind, and that's the only social distancing that'll work. But another point, Jim, is you shouldn't try to be social distancing. We've been evolving and living with these viruses, and every kind of virus you can imagine that causes these respiratory diseases as animals for 1 billion years or more. Our immune system has evolved to deal with this. This is the very nature of our human being in this environment on planet Earth where there are viruses. You cannot easily undo that. I think we should be thinking in terms of the immune system and not in terms of trying to create a sterile environment, which is an impossible thing. Okay? And that's why in the paper, I tried to develop a little conceptual model of how deaths occur in one of these things. And I explained this distribution of immune response strength and cited some papers and so on, and how that distribution of immune vulnerable parts of the population is what's going to determine how many people are going to die. And so how do you make it so that you don't have inequity, so that you have a distribution where there's a long tail of a lot of immune vulnerable people are maintained in the society, as opposed to getting what they need in a low metabolic stress environment? You know, that's really what matters in terms of reducing death. So I hope that my paper, even though I don't say all this explicitly, but will inspire people to start thinking in that direction. But that's it would take too long now to explain this. I think that would be the subject of another video. But it's in my paper, and I want to thank you for wanting me to talk about this paper. And
yeah, it was really great hearing you talk about all the details so far. I would like to do another video about that, the probability density function and the energy consumption of the immune system that you talk about in joules per second.
Sure.
That was quite interesting to read.
It's a very creative part of the paper, and I think it kind of undoes what many virologists would say. So it's not going to make a lot of virologists happy, but I think it's based on the reality of this winter burden cycle, and it's how robust it is and how regular it is. And so I think that is an observation that is true and undeniable. And so we have to try to develop an understanding of the phenomenon based on the things that we're most sure of, you know, and that's what I try to do in the paper. But I think you've let me talk for way too long, so we should probably call it a day.
Yeah, let's do that. I think it was okay that you talked a lot and I just asked a couple of questions because I really enjoyed this conversation, Denis.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I enjoyed it a lot too, and I look forward to seeing you again on YouTube.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Have a nice evening then.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.